to my channel. I have a new favorite horror movie, Hereditary, by writer-director Ari Aster. I didn't love the movie the first time I saw it. The ending was profoundly disappointing, doubly so because the movie had been so good up to that point. The story was character-driven and the actors gave stunningly good performances. Also, Ari Aster infused the movie with what I want to call nihilistic realism. A sense of doom seemed to flow off the screen. The inventive film's soundtrack helped to create this effect. My favorite thing of all was that Heredity was stuffed to the brim with delicious Easter eggs. In short, Heredity had seemed to me, right up to the end, to be one of the best movies of any genre I had seen in years. And then that ending happened, and I was bitterly disappointed. Peter's emotions seemed all wrong. Because of that, the ending didn't make sense to me. It was like Aster had been making a promise to me throughout the movie, a promise that things made sense and would continue to make sense from the perspective of the movie, given its particular and perhaps peculiar logic, and he broke it. Or at least so it seemed. I felt like a kid on Christmas Day who gleefully unwrapped her present only to find a lump of coal. I was reminded of a line from The Princess Bride, "Life is pain, Highness. Anyone who says differently is selling something." Only in this context, I suppose it would be life is disappointment. I shrugged and tried to put the movie out of my mind. But I couldn't do that. There was something about the film that lingered with me. I started to think about the film and the ending at odd moments throughout the day. I found that I couldn't just shrug and say, oh well. There was something about the movie, something compelling. It was like a puzzle I couldn't not work on. I kept wondering how Aster could have done such a brilliant job all the way up to the end and then dropped the ball. And then I asked myself, which is more likely, that Aster botched the ending or that I had missed something? I realized I had lightly missed something. That admission took me down a rather deep rabbit hole. I watched Heredity again, read the screenplay, watched the director's cut of Aster's latest movie, Midsommar, watched his disturbing thesis film, The Strange Thing About the Johnsons, and looked at hours and hours of commentary on Heredity, including interviews with Ari Aster himself. Yes, I am obsessed. Anyway, I have come to a tentative conclusion. In Heredity, there is a story within a story, one I did not see at first because it is not obvious. Though it isn't hidden, it's almost like an optical or auditory illusion, but one having to do with audience expectation. Every single one of the film critics I had watched or read had, like myself, known going into the theater that Heredity was a supernatural horror film. Think about all the supernatural horror films you've ever watched. You know, stories where a demon or fell spirit possesses a human host. The demon is the big bad, the villain, and it is the hero's task to save the world from the evil threat. What is the least likely thing you would expect from a movie that is billed as a supernatural horror? I'll leave you with that question for a moment. I do answer it, at least I give you my answer for it, at the end. To be honest, I'm nervous about putting my interpretation forward because I don't think anyone else has looked at Heredity quite this way. This makes me think I can't be correct, but I can't get this story out of my head, so I'm going to share my interpretation of the movie with you in the hope that doing so will act as my own exorcism. I need to put these questions to bed, so please, after you read my crazy musings, tell me what you think of them. Am I chasing shadows, or might I be onto something? So, what I want to do in this article. In this article, I will first give a summary of Ari Aster's debut movie, Hereditary, and then discuss in detail how it ends, but all the while trying not to bias your interpretation of the ending. Then I will talk about what I think is happening. Spoiler warning. In what follows, I walk through all the main plot points of Hereditary. If you haven't watched the movie, I urge you to grab some popcorn, turn out the lights, and enjoy. And then, please come back. A summary of Hereditary. Annie Graham, the protagonist, lives with her husband Steve, their eccentric younger child Charlie, and their elder child Peter. Annie is a miniaturist and is currently making dioramas, in her case doll houses, that represent important scenes from her life, rendered from a neutral perspective. Steve is a therapist and seems to be, more or less, the rock of the family. He helps keep the family functioning and sane, well, sane-ish. Charlie is eccentric. She loves chocolate and clicking her tongue. She is deathly allergic to nuts and likes constructing mannequins by placing a severed animal head, the animal was already dead, on top of a body made of found objects such as discarded bottles. Peter seems mainly interested in smoking marijuana and trying to get a date with Bridget, a cute girl in his English class. As the movie opens, we see the family attending the funeral of Annie's mother, Ellen Lee. We discover that Ellen was controlling and not well liked by anyone in her family. Both Ellen and Annie are wearing a sigil that we will come to discover is that of Paimon, one of the kings of hell. A week later, Ellen's corpse is dug out of its grave. Steve is told about this, but he decides not to inform Annie. Annie seems to sense that Steve is hiding something, but rather than confront him, she tells Steve that she is going to a movie, but instead attends a support group for the bereaved. Here Annie confides to the group that her father and brother had struggles with mental illness before they died. Her brother complained that his mother, Ellen, was putting people inside him, and he hung himself in her bedroom. Annie's father was depressed and starved himself to death. Annie confesses that she didn't let her mother near her son, but, perhaps out of guilt, she gave Charlie to Ellen. As one might expect, Charlie and her grandmother became close. The movie takes an ugly turn when Peter goes to a party one of the teenagers at school is throwing. Peter doesn't know the person hosting the party, but he thinks Bridget will be attending and hopes to talk to her. Peter asks Annie if he can go, though he lies and says it's a school party and that there won't be any alcohol there. Of course not. And Annie says sure, but forces him to take his sister, saying that the child needs to get out and meet more people. At the party, Charlie eats a piece of chocolate cake that has nuts in it, and because of her nut allergy, her throat begins to swell, making breathing difficult. When Peter discovers this, he panics, picks Charlie up, carries her out to his car, and speeds toward the hospital. On the way there, Charlie, gasping for breath, sticks her head out the window. At this moment, Peter notices the body of a deer lying across the road and swerves to miss it. Unfortunately, he drives close to a telephone pole and Charlie is decapitated. The telephone pole, by the way, has Payman's sigil painted on it. Peter is traumatized and drives home with Charlie's corpse still in the back seat. He parks, turns off the car, and goes to bed. The next morning, his mother leaves the house to buy art supplies and notices an odd smell. She investigates and finds the body of her daughter. Annie is devastated. She can barely stand. Steve, though, is there for both her and Peter. After this incident, the tension between Annie and Peter is intense. Peter feels incredibly guilty for his role in his sister's death, and Annie blames both Peter and herself. Annie goes to another support group meeting, but then, while still in the parking lot, seems to change her mind. However, before she can drive off, a woman, Joan, runs over to her and talks with her. Joan tries to get Annie to come into the meeting and shares with her that she has lost both her son and grandson. Joan and Annie eventually bond, and Joan shows Annie how to perform a seance so that she can communicate with Charlie. Joan says, though, that two conditions must be met for the seance to be successful. First, the entire family must be present in the home when the ritual is performed, and second, she needs an item, something of Charlie's, to form a link with her. Joan says that she used her grandson's chalkboard to communicate with her grandson's spirit. Annie chooses Charlie's sketchbook. In the dark of night, after her family has fallen asleep, she recites the incantation. I will not say it here just in case. And leaves Charlie's sketchbook open to a blank page for her spirit to draw in. We don't see this. We hear Annie's description of it when she, near hysterics, wakes her husband and son to get them to participate in the seance. Steve is understandably reluctant to go along with Annie's request. He is worried about Peter, what effect attending a seance to contact his dead sister might have on the teen. Also, Steve seems irritated at Annie. I had the feeling that he was frustrated with himself for not being able to help her, and frustrated with her because she wasn't helping Peter. And Steve was getting tired of being the responsible, sane person in their relationship. During the seance, Annie channels a terrified and disoriented Charlie. This surprised everyone. Peter, though, isn't just surprised, he is terrified. So Steve throws water on Annie, breaking her trance. The day after the seance, Peter goes to school and, while there, a spirit attempts to possess him, leading to some very strange behavior. Peter raises his arm and makes a particular shape with his hand. We will come to discover that the shape is reminiscent of Payman's scepter. Also, Peter hears a clicking noise that sounds like Charlie right before this attack. During the incident, Peter thrashes around and bangs his head on his desk, breaking his nose. The pain seems to drive the spirit away. Steve is called and picks up a heavily sedated Peter from the hospital. With Annie's help, Steve carries his unconscious son to bed. After the seance, Annie begins to think that Charlie might be malevolent, and so throws Charlie's sketchbook into the fireplace, where it catches on fire. As it does, Annie's arm begins to burn. When she snatches the sketchbook out of the fire, the flames licking her arm go out. Scared by this, Annie goes to visit Joan and notices again that her confidante's doormat is very similar to the mats that Ellen used to make. Joan doesn't answer her door, but the camera goes through the door, revealing part of Joan's apartment to the viewer. A couple of sigils to Payman are prominently displayed, and a diorama Charlie was creating has been finished. 3 headless mannequins bow before 3 animal heads. They are all oriented around a miniature upright mannequin wearing the head of a pigeon. When Joan doesn't answer, Annie goes back home and finally looks through Ellen's boxes, desperate to understand what's going on. Annie finds pictures of her mother with Joan about 20 years ago, and Joan is wearing Payman's sigil, the same necklace Ellen wore. Annie also discovers that her mother was called Queen Leah, and that she led a cult that worshipped Payman, one of the 8 kings of hell. Payman was said to be the king of hell, who was most obedient to Lucifer. This is from the script. Annie finds a highlighted paragraph. When successfully invoked, Payman will possess the most vulnerable host. Only when the ritual is complete will Payman be locked into his ordained host. Once locked in, a new ritual is required to unlock the possession. A sentence underlined in pencil reads, Payman is male, thus covetous of a male human body. After this, Annie goes into the attic. I'm not sure why she does this. Perhaps she has put some of her mother's things up there and wants to investigate further. Anyway, Annie finds her mother's decapitated body. She panics. After Steve and Annie get Peter up to bed, Annie begs her husband to go and look in the attic. Steve is at his wit's end and doesn't want to play along, but he agrees and is shocked to find Ellen's decapitated body up there. Steve looks at Annie as though he has never seen her before, and asks Annie if she put Ellen's body in the attic. Annie truthfully denies it, but Steve no longer trusts her. Annie now shows Steve her mother's book of old photographs. She shows him the photos of Ellen and Joan together wearing Payman's sigil, but Steve waves it away. He thinks it's all nonsense. But Annie isn't going to drop it. She tells Steve that she brought something evil into their home when she did the seance, and that this something has to do with Charlie. Annie wants to do the heroic thing and sacrifice herself for her family. However, she can't bring herself to throw the book into the flames, so she begs Steve to burn the book for her. He refuses. Finally, Annie finds the courage to die for her family and throws the book into the flames, expecting to be consumed in a fiery inferno. But she doesn't burn. Instead, Steve is set aflame and burns to death. Annie screams and, mid-scream, appears to become possessed. At around the same time this is happening, Peter wakes up. It is difficult to see, but Annie is in Peter's room, levitating near the ceiling. Just before Peter looks in her direction, she skitters away, moving in jerky, crab-like movements over the walls. Eventually, Annie chases Peter through the houses and into the attic where, terrified, he seals himself in. But, unfortunately for Peter, members of the cult are already in the attic and let Annie in. While levitating several feet off the floor, Annie, this is in full view of Peter, begins to saw off her own head with piano wire. At just this moment, Peter sees 3 naked cult members hiding in the shadows. This terrifies him even more, and he runs out of the attic window, falling onto the ground below. A moment later, a swirl of light enters his body and he gets up. His manner has changed. The script says he seems to be in some sort of trance. Then Peter clicks his tongue the way Charlie used to. Haltingly, Peter trudges up to the treehouse, following a now headless Annie who levitates up into the treehouse before him. When Peter climbs into the treehouse, he finds Joan and several other cult members there, as well as the headless bodies of Annie and Ellen. They are all bowing to a mannequin that has Charlie's decapitated head resting upon its shoulders. Peter seems dazed, traumatized. When he looks back at the headless bodies, they now face him. The cult members are now bowing to him. Joan says to Peter, Hey, Charlie, you're all right now. You are Payman, one of the 8 kings of hell. We have looked to the northwest and called you in. We've corrected your first female body and given you now this healthy male host. We reject the Trinity and pray devoutly to you, great Payman. Give us your knowledge of all secret things and all mysteries of the earth. Bring us honor, wealth, and good familiars, and bind all men to our will, as we have bound ourselves for now and ever to yours. It's not at all creepy, no? Then there is a close-up on Peter. In the script it says, Peter's eyes are buzzing. The final scene of the movie is of a diorama that portrays cultists bowing to Peter, who is standing in front of the grotesque mannequin that has the head of his sister on it. The end. Interpreting Hereditary. What the hell? There's obviously a lot going on at the end, and everything seems to raise more questions than it answers. But we do know two things. First, we know that Charlie was never really Charlie. Charlie was Payman. The director confirmed this in his Variety interview. Also, Payman didn't possess Charlie. Charlie wasn't in her body with Payman. Charlie was displaced soon after she was born. So the child that Annie gave birth to is no more. Instead, it was just the demon. Another way of saying this is that instead of possessing Charlie, Payman was incarnated within her. I believe this difference is important, and I'll discuss it in more detail in a moment. Second, this family is fated to have this end. Their actions are, and always were, controlled by a cult. This movie is about the end stage of a project that has taken several decades to complete. 3 sacrifices were required to put Payman into a new host. The first sacrifice was Ellen, the second was Charlie, or Payman, that was the same thing, and the third was Annie. The mechanism of the cult's fiddling is, well, what to call it other than fate. When the cult interferes to tweak things, this is heralded by a white light. I'll talk more about the white light in a bit. Here's my take on the ending. My interpretation is fairly novel. I haven't talked with anyone who shares it, and only 2 other commentators seem to be thinking of things the same way I am. I'll put those notes on the screen. So, I don't know, make of this what you will. I think all the events of the movie revolve around the cult, the Demon King Payman, and the difference between possession and incarnation. Here's what I think. Charlie does not know that he is a demon. And why would he? He was raised as a human, first as a baby, then a toddler, then a child, then a young woman. Payman believes he is a human female. But he is not human. He is a demon incarnated in human form. And that's one reason why he doesn't fit in. Still, Charlie is an intelligent being with the capacity to have emotions, one who loves his grandmother and who is worried who is going to take care of him when his grandmother and mother die. So not only does Payman not know that he is a demon, he doesn't know he has powers that most people don't. Or if he suspects, he is smart enough to keep that information to himself. So this left the cult with a problem. As long as Payman didn't know who he was, he couldn't do anything for the cult. They wanted Payman to bring them wealth and power, but Payman can't do either as long as he thinks he's a teenage girl. So far, I think everything I've speculated about is more or less on firm ground. It is substantiated either by the script, the movie, or interviews Ari Aster has given. Now I'm going to guess at something. A couple of somethings. I think that the cult believed that as long as Payman was in the body of a female, an unsuitable host, that Payman could not come to know his true identity. Or perhaps they simply didn't want Payman to realize he was in an unsuitable host. Here's another guess. I think that Payman didn't want to be controlled by the cult. I don't think he wanted to possess anyone, and I don't think he wanted to be incarnated. I mean, who would want to be controlled by a cult? They're a bunch of psychopaths, willing to sacrifice those they love so they can bring a demon king into the world in order to gain wealth and power. It would be difficult to find a more unsympathetic group of people. Recall Annie's speech during the group therapy session. She said that her father was deeply depressed and had starved himself to death, and that her brother complained of his mother trying to put other people inside of him and chose to hang himself in her bedroom. It could have been that the humans in question, the father and the son, objected to their loved one, Ellen, their mother and wife, trying to get a demon to possess their mortal forms. Or it could have been that whenever the cult put Payman into a human body, the demon found a way to kill the body and so be released from his captivity. So maybe one reason they incarnated Payman into Annie's infant daughter's body was that they didn't want Payman to know who he was. They wanted him to lose his memories. They knew if he incarnated that he would lose his memory. If he lost his memory, he'd be easier to control, and then they could bind Payman to their will. Think of the hell Peter must have been in at the end of the movie. The cult had just placed Charlie's spirit into him. This is a possession, so Peter is still there. Charlie loved Peter and vice versa. Yes, Peter had accidentally killed Charlie, but Charlie must have known this was an accident. Perhaps the cult may have been counting on Charlie's loving Peter and so not killing him. his body because of that love. But that's just speculation on my part. We are shown, this is in the book called Invocations that Annie finds among her mother's things, that there needed to be a ceremony to take payment out of the girl's body, out of Charlie's body, and another ceremony to seal payment into a new body. That's where the three sacrifices come in. The three sacrifices being Ellen, Charlie, and Annie. One can ask why the cult began the process of taking payment out of Charlie's body and putting him into Peter's when they did. I think that the inciting incident was Ellen's death. She could have asked the cult to kill her, or it could have been a natural death, but now that Peter was more or less mature, he could be the next and possibly final host for Paimon, and so it was time. Paimon had the power to animate the dead, and so perhaps Ellen thought that Paimon would bring her back to some semblance of life. That said, being trapped in a decaying, decapitated corpse for eternity wouldn't be my idea of a good time. Okay, so the white light. I've got to address this at some point, so let's do it now. Throughout the movie, there is a white light that precedes certain significant scenes. Some people believe that the white light signifies the action of Paimon. I'm not going to say that's wrong. The cult could somehow have learned how to harness Paimon's power without him being aware of what they were doing. Again, this could be the result of binding Paimon to their will. But this is just my idea. I could be completely wrong. I think the white light is two things. First, I think the white light represents the spiritual action of the cult. It represents the action of a spell. Also, and this was suggested by Dan Stubbs in his article Hereditary, Baffled by the Must-See Horror Film of 2018. Here are the big questions answered. It's a good article. I thought he had a great insight into the white light when he said that it does kind of look like the light from Annie's magnified, the light that she wears on the top of her head when she's building her miniatures, the headgear that she wears. And so if that's part of what Asher had in mind, then I think that the white light also represents fate, or at least actions or events that are being dictated by something completely out of one's control. Anyway, let's look at some examples. One of the first times we see the white light is when Charlie is in her room, assembling one of her dolls. She notices a white light dancing around the room. The light cannot be Paimon because Charlie is Paimon, and he's not doing this. I think this is the cult alone. I think the cult is conducting a ritual and is summoning Paimon. This interpretation is consistent with the script. Charlie was fond of her grandmother, and that's who she sees in the clearing. She wants to go and meet her gran. By the way, I think that if Charlie had gone to meet her gran, this is complete speculation, but I think that if she had gone to meet her gran, that she would have died and been beheaded. Peter brought Annie's attention to the fact that Charlie was no longer in the house, and so Annie went looking for Charlie and brought her back. And so they ruined the cult's plans. But there are other times, for instance, when Peter is walking down a hallway in his school, where we see a white light, and shortly afterward, Charlie tries to take possession of Peter's body. What I think was happening here is that the cult was conducting a ritual, and the white light symbolizes the action of the spell. Yes, Charlie Paimon was involved in the action of that spell, but I believe it was the cult that was guiding Charlie to possess Peter. I doubt the spirit demon really knew what it was doing. Given these and similar incidents, I believe that the white light symbolizes the result of the cult's rituals, spells, ceremonies, whatever you want to call them. It signifies spiritual activity. So when we see a white light go into Peter at the end of the movie, yes, that is Charlie, or Paimon, entering his body, but I think the white light is also the action of the cult spell guiding Charlie into Peter's body. I don't think Charlie knew what he was doing. After all, when Annie called Charlie into herself during the seance, Charlie had no idea what was happening. Okay, so now let's look at the difference between incarnation and possession. I've already touched on this. I think that Paimon, at the direction of the cult, tried to possess both Ellen's husband and son, but these attempts were unsuccessful. Since Ellen was diagnosed with DID, dissociative identity disorder, I would imagine that for at least a little while she was possessed by Paimon. Since this was a possession and not a reincarnation, Ellen was still there. It's just that there was someone else, another soul or spirit, sharing her body with her. As I've said, I think that when Paimon, when his spirit was incarnated in human flesh, the original soul was, as Ari Aster said, displaced. displaced so that a demon king could take up residence. And that's why Payman, when in Charlie's body, had none of his previous memories. Or at least that's what makes sense to me. Now let's look at things that don't make sense to me. I don't have an explanation for some things in this movie. For instance, Annie is possessed right after Steve bursts into flames. I don't believe this is Payman. For one thing, Payman doesn't yet know who he is, and so would still act as though he is the spirit of a confused teenage girl. Think about how Payman acted when he briefly possessed Annie. But the mother Annie acted with clear intention. Another thing that points toward there being at least one other spirit besides Payman is that at the end of the movie, Annie, now headless, floats ahead of Peter and levitates up into the treehouse. If Payman doesn't know who he is yet, then I don't see how he could be the one who is levitating Annie's body. So who's doing it? I think there are two possibilities. First, it could be other spirits that the cult has summoned and has under its control, and that would make sense. After all, it seems unlikely that right out of the gate the cult would set their sights on capturing a king of hell. You'd think they would work their way up to that, but who knows. Another possibility is that, as I've speculated, Annie is being manipulated by the cult themselves. This world is clearly magical, and if demons exist and can be summoned and bound, why couldn't the members of the cult have the ability to control Annie? After all, there is that bottle of green paint that tips over without Annie touching it. Her hand is near it, but never touches it. That's quite plain. A white light flashes just before this happens, and that, I think, suggests the action of the cult. To sum up, when I first watched Hereditary, it didn't seem plausible that Payman, a king of hell, would be completely freaked out by learning that he was a king of hell. Sure, perhaps at first there would be a bit of confusion, but then his memories would rush in and he would realize, oh right, I'm a king of hell, and I have these memories and
I can subjugate the world.
Or something. But that's not what happens. Peter is clearly traumatized. My interpretation hinges upon Peter's obvious terror at the end. I watched a number of interviews Ari Aster gave. I read the script. I watched the movie again and again and again. And most importantly, I watched the film Aster did for his thesis, The Strange Thing About the Johnsons. I won't go into detail about the plot of that short film, but it has to do with really, really bad things. However, instead of the father doing very bad things to his child, the child does very bad things to his father. So, in that film, we have an unusual victim. The pattern is turned upon its head. It is the same inversion that we see in Hereditary. Usually, even if the demon loses, he, she, or it is not a victim. But here, the demon clearly is the victim of the cult. On this reading, Payman is nothing more than another pawn in the cult's game, in their master plan. He is just as much of a victim, a cog, as Annie or Steve or Peter were. Aster is turning things upside down, subverting one of the mainstays of the horror genre, the evil demon who wants to subjugate mankind. To answer the question I asked at the beginning of this article, what is the least likely thing one would expect from a movie that is billed as a supernatural horror? Well, it's that the demon isn't evil. It is that the demon is the victim of evil humans. But that's what we have here, or so I argue. What did you think of the ending of Hereditary? Do you agree with my interpretation? Is there something I'm missing? And I'm sure there is. Please do leave a comment. And thanks for listening to my rambling review of Hereditary. Please like and subscribe. I'll catch you later.